My brother-in-law Marcus was practically gloating as he read through the will one more time. His expensive suit pressed perfectly, his smugness filling that mahogany-paneled conference room like cheap cologne. He was convinced that after 15 years of treating me like dirt, he'd finally won, that I'd walk out of there with nothing while he inherited the massive Whitmore family estate. But when I calmly reached into my briefcase and placed that century-old deed on the polished table, his face went white as a sheet. The family lawyer's jaw literally dropped, and Marcus started screaming so loud that security had to escort him out. Let me tell you how we got there. Started with a phone call 3 weeks ago. My husband David had been battling cancer for 2 years, and I knew our time was running out. But even then, he was thinking about everyone else but himself. "Emma," he whispered, gripping my hand, "I need to tell you something about the estate. About what my grandfather really left behind." I'd been married to David for 15 years, and his family had made it crystal clear I wasn't good enough for their precious son. I was a high school English teacher from a working-class family. David was a Whitmore, old-money, Connecticut elite. His father Richard owned a chain of luxury car dealerships. His mother Victoria spent her days at the country club making sure everyone knew where the family stood on the social ladder, and his brother Marcus was a Harvard MBA investment banker married to a socialite named Priscilla, who looked at me like I was something she'd scrape off her designer heels. Every family gathering was an exercise in subtle humiliation. They discussed their European vacations, their stock portfolios, their connections to senators and judges, all while I sat there in my Target dress, trying to contribute to conversations about things I'd never experienced. But David was different. When I met him at that community college where I was volunteering to teach adult literacy, he was wearing jeans and sneakers, his hair slightly messy from helping students move heavy desks. No pretense, no flashy watch, just this genuine smile that lit up the room. He told me those volunteer hours were the only time he felt like himself, away from the pressure to be the perfect Whitmore son. We fell in love over late-night conversations about books, about what really mattered in life. He'd grown up with everything money could buy, but what he craved was authenticity, real connection. The problem started the moment he proposed with a simple ring he'd saved for months to buy. When we announced our engagement at Sunday dinner, the silence around that dining room table was deafening. Victoria literally sniffed and asked David if he was sure about this decision. Richard pulled him aside later and offered me $50,000 to reconsider my intentions. The wedding was a nightmare. They insisted on paying for it, not out of generosity, but so they could control every detail and make sure it reflected appropriately on the family name. I watched them turn what should have been the happiest day of my life into a social performance where I was essentially an unwelcome guest at my own wedding. When David got cancer, everything became worse. The diagnosis hit us like a freight train, and suddenly all those family dynamics became toxic. Victoria would visit the hospital and spend the entire time talking about how stressful this was for the family, how it was affecting their social calendar. Marcus would show up for 5 minutes, check his phone constantly and leave. But the worst part was how they blamed me. Not directly. The Whitmores were too refined for that, but I could see it in their eyes, hear it in their carefully chosen words. In their minds, if David had married someone appropriate, someone with the right connections, maybe he'd have had access to better doctors, experimental treatments. The truth was, we had excellent care. My health insurance through the school district was actually better than Marcus's investment firm plan. But facts didn't matter. They needed someone to blame, and I was the obvious target. During David's final weeks, Richard and Victoria had the audacity to suggest I should step back and let them handle the arrangements. They wanted to move him to a private facility where they could control access, essentially cutting me out of my own husband's final days. David overheard that conversation. It was one of the few times I saw him get truly angry during his illness. He told them I was his wife, that I would make all decisions about his care, and if they couldn't respect that, they could leave. That's when he told me about his grandfather. "My great-grandfather built the estate in 1923, he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But what the family doesn't know What my grandfather made me promise never to tell them, is that he never actually left it to my father. He explained that Harold Whitmore had been disgusted by how materialistic the family had become. He saw how his son treated people, how focused everyone was on money and status instead of character. So he did something unprecedented. He put the estate in a trust with very specific conditions. The trust says the estate goes to whoever in the family demonstrates the values grandfather held dear: integrity, selflessness, genuine care for others. He left detailed instructions about evaluating character over net worth. David pulled out an old leather portfolio from his bedside drawer, something I'd never seen before. Inside was the original deed to the Whitmore estate. 450 acres of prime Connecticut real estate. The main house, guest houses, stables, everything. Valued at over $12 million. But more importantly, there was a letter from Harold explaining his decision. He'd been watching the family for years, documenting how they treated people. The letter detailed specific instances where he'd observed me, helping an elderly neighbor with groceries, staying late to tutor struggling students without extra pay, treating the housekeeping staff with respect when Richard and Victoria barely acknowledged they existed. "He decided you're the only one worthy of what he built," David whispered. David died 4 days later. I held his hand as he passed, whispering that I loved him. Richard and Victoria stood at the back of the room, more concerned with their own grief performance than actually saying goodbye to their son. The funeral was everything you'd expect from the Whitmores. Elaborate, expensive, and utterly hollow. Marcus gave a eulogy that sounded like it had been written by a PR firm, full of generic platitudes about David's potential and promise, but nothing about who he actually was. I spoke last, and I talked about the real David, the man who'd spend his Saturday mornings reading to kids at the library, who'd secretly send Christmas cards to every student I'd ever taught, who'd donated his entire trust fund allowance to cancer research instead of buying the luxury car his father expected. You could hear a pin drop in that church. I think it was the first time anyone had talked about David as a real person instead of as a Whitmore family asset. After the service, the family made their move. Richard pulled me aside. "Emma, I think it's time we discussed your situation. David's gone, and while we appreciated your dedication during his illness, you understand you're not really family anymore." Victoria nodded along. "Of course, we'll make sure you're taken care of. There's a small inheritance from David's personal accounts. Nothing extravagant, but enough to help you transition." Marcus joined the conversation, practically vibrating with excitement. "The thing is, Emma, the family has obligations. The estate, the business interests, the social commitments. It's all very complicated. You wouldn't really know how to handle any of it. They were basically telling me to take my little payout and disappear so they could pretend the last 15 years never happened. I listened to their whole speech without saying a word. Then I told them I'd need some time to process everything, which they seemed to interpret as cooperation. 3 weeks later came the will reading. I knew David had left me our house and about $150,000 from his personal accounts. Not life-changing money, but enough to pay off the mortgage and give me some breathing room. What they didn't know was that I'd spent those 3 weeks meeting with Harold's trustee, Edward Ashford, whose Hartford law firm had been administering the estate trust for 40 years. The managing partner had been waiting for this moment since David's diagnosis. "Mr. Whitmore was very specific about the timing," Ashford explained during our first meeting. "The estate was to remain in trust until David's death or divorce, at which point it would transfer to whoever he had chosen to share his life with, assuming that person met the character requirements." Ashford had been observing the family for decades, documenting their behavior, their choices, their treatment of others. He had files on everyone: Richard's habit of cheating contractors, Victoria's casual cruelty to service workers, Marcus's history of lying to clients about investment returns. And he had files on me too. 15 years of documentation showing how I'd treated David's family with respect despite their constant disrespect. How I'd cared for David during his illness without any thought of personal benefit. "In 40 years of practicing law," Ashford told me, "I've never seen someone fulfill Harold Whitmore's requirements as clearly as you have." So when I walked into that mahogany-paneled conference room, I was carrying more than just my grief. I was carrying the hopes of a man who'd believed that character mattered more than blood. Richard, Victoria, and Marcus were already seated, all dressed in their finest funeral attire. Marcus's wife Priscilla was there too, probably already mentally redecorating the estate. They looked at me with that familiar mixture of pity and condescension. The family lawyer, a nervous man named Patterson, cleared his throat and began reading David's personal will. It was exactly what we'd expected. The house to me, his watch to Marcus, some personal items to friends. Marcus kept checking his Rolex, clearly impatient to get to the main event. When Patterson finished, Richard leaned forward with that familiar entitled smile. Now, I believe we should discuss the family estate. Emma, as we mentioned, there are provisions for you, but the bulk of the inheritance will naturally go to. Actually, Patterson interrupted, looking uncomfortable, there seems to be some confusion about the estate. I've been contacted by another law firm claiming to represent the actual owners of the property. Marcus laughed, that condescending chuckle I'd heard 1,000 times. That's ridiculous. The estate has been in our family for a century. There must be some mistake. That's when Edward Ashford walked into the room, carrying a thick legal portfolio. He was in his 70s, impeccably dressed, with a kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of handling high-stakes legal matters. "Good afternoon," he said calmly. "I'm Edward Ashford from Ashford, Mitchell & Associates. I represent the Harold Whitmore Charitable Trust, which has been the legal owner of the Whitmore family estate since 1987. The silence in that room was absolutely deafening. I could practically hear Marcus's heart hammering in his chest. Richard found his voice first, his face going red. "That's impossible. My father left the estate to me. I've been paying the taxes, the maintenance, everything for 35 years. Ashford opened his portfolio with practiced calm. "Mr. Whitmore, your father established a revocable trust in 1987, 3 years before his death. While you've been managing the property, legal ownership has remained with the trust pending fulfillment of certain conditions outlined in the original trust documents." Victoria was turning pale. "What conditions? What are you talking about?" Instead of answering immediately, Ashford looked directly at me with a slight nod. "Mrs. Peterson, I believe you have something that belongs to this discussion." This was my moment. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the original deed, the one David had given me, along with Harold Whitmore's letter and all the documentation I'd received from Ashford's firm. I placed them on the polished table without saying a word. Marcus grabbed for the papers, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and panic. "This is a forgery," he shouted. "This is some kind of scam." Ashford read from Harold's letter. "I have watched my son Richard become consumed by greed and social status, treating good people poorly based on their economic circumstances. I have watched my grandson Marcus develop an even worse character. But I have observed Emma demonstrate more integrity, kindness, and genuine decency than the rest of my family combined." Richard was sputtering. "You can't just give away a family estate to some outsider. Your father was ensuring his life's work would go to someone who shared his values," Ashford replied calmly. Marcus had gone from shouting to hysteria. "She's not even blood family. She's nobody. She's a fucking high school teacher." That's when I spoke. "You're right, Marcus. I'm a high school teacher. I make $43,000 a year, drive a 10-year-old Honda, and buy my clothes at Target. And apparently, that makes me more worthy of your grandfather's legacy than you are." Victoria tried tears, saying David wouldn't want to tear the family apart. I pulled out a letter David had written for this exact moment. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, my family is trying to make you feel guilty. Don't let them. You are exactly who grandfather wanted. Not because of blood, but because of character. They had 15 years to treat you with respect and chose arrogance instead. Grandfather saw that. Now it's time for consequences." The room erupted. Marcus screamed about lawsuits. Richard demanded more documentation. Victoria sobbed about humiliation. But every document was authentic, every legal requirement met. The estate, All 450 acres, the main house, everything now belonged to me. Marcus offered to buy it, escalating from $2 million to $10 million. When I didn't respond, he started threatening lawsuits. That's when I revealed the final piece: Harold's foundation. The estate was to become headquarters for a charity helping working-class families access education and healthcare. This wasn't just inheritance. It was accepting responsibility to use the wealth as Harold intended. Marcus finally understood he wasn't just losing money. He was being publicly judged by his own grandfather and found wanting. That's when security had to escort him out, still screaming about how a nobody couldn't own what was rightfully his. That was 6 months ago. I'm writing this from Harold's library in what's now my estate. Marcus did sue, but every court dismissed his claims. His own lawyers eventually advised him to stop wasting money. The foundation is running now. We've provided scholarships to 34 students and we're opening a free clinic next month. Richard's dealerships are struggling. Victoria had to resign from her country club due to the scandal, and Marcus lost most of his clients after spending their money on his failed lawsuit. He and Priscilla divorced last month. I still teach 3 days a week. I love those kids too much to quit entirely. But now I also run a foundation that changes lives daily. The guest houses provide temporary housing for families facing eviction, and the stable has become a workshop where local kids learn trades. This isn't the life I imagined when I married David, but it's exactly what Harold Whitmore envisioned. Sometimes I walk the estate at sunset and think about a man who believed character mattered more than bloodline, that integrity was worth more than inheritance. He was right. If this story of poetic justice resonated with you as much as it did with me telling it, please hit that like button on this video. And make sure to subscribe to the channel because I've got plenty more stories about people who thought money could buy them everything, only to discover that character and integrity are the only currencies that really matter in the end. In the comments below, tell me where you're watching from, what country, what city. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And what do you think about Marcus and his family getting exactly what they deserved? Do you think Harold Whitmore made the right choice? I'm always fascinated to hear your thoughts on these real-life stories of vindication and justice. Keep being good people out there, and remember, sometimes the universe has a way of rewarding those who stay true to their values, even when it seems like the bullies are winning.